Hi, I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for anyone who loves hearing fascinating tales about remarkable people, intriguing topics, and significant historical events. Our hope is to inspire you to uncover and share your history and your story. In this episode of Your History, Your Story, we are very happy to welcome back a truly distinguished guest, Pulitzer Prize winning author, renowned historian, and the George Henry Davis 1886 Professor of American History, Emeritus, at Princeton University, James M. McPherson. Jim previously joined us to discuss the military, political, and international significance of the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history. Today, he returns to take us even deeper into the human experience of the Civil War, drawing from his landmark 1997 book, For Cause and Comrades, Why Men Fought in the Civil War. In this episode, Jim explores the powerful and often deeply personal motivations that compelled both Union and Confederate soldiers to continue fighting, even in the face of death, devastating wounds, and unimaginable hardship. Drawing from numerous letters and diaries of Civil War soldiers, he helps us understand not just how the war was fought, but why it was endured. I'd now like to welcome James McPherson to our show. Welcome, Jim.
Well, thank you for having me again.
Well, we had such a good time. We were talking about a very serious topic in American history, and it was about the Battle of Antietam, pretty much the bloodiest day in American history, as far as I remember, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Yeah, and we spent a lot of time talking about the military and political and even diplomatic significance of that battle. But I couldn't help, after we were done, I was thinking about it, and I thought about all those individual soldiers who participated that day, who gave their lives and were wounded and impacted emotionally and all that. And I love history, all aspects of it, but it's the personal histories that have always intrigued me, have made me feel like I want to know, what were they thinking? What was going on in their minds? And then I was looking through your list of books, and you wrote a book called For Cause and Comrades, Why Men Fought in the Civil War. You wrote it back in 1997.
That's correct.
Well, I listened to it, audiobook, and I listened to it again more recently, and it was fantastic. It sort of answered a lot of the questions that I had in my mind, made me think more about how maybe I would have reacted if I was one of those soldiers in one of those situations. It was so amazing because it boiled it down to the actual people who were in the thick of it, out on the field and dealing with all kinds of hardships and questions and passions and fears and all that. So let me ask you this question, James. I'll call you Jim. Sorry. Jim, what motivated you to write that book?
Well, I think two things. One, what you just mentioned about your own thinking about history and about the individuals in history. I had done a lot of research and writing about the Civil War, its causes, what the issues were, why the leaders on both sides, the politicians, the president, the Congress people, and so on, how did they look at the issues of the war? How did they understand what the war was about? And there's plenty of information about that. The speeches in Congress, editorials in newspapers, letters by Congress people to each other, presidents to each other, politicians, and so on. But I wondered further what the soldiers who actually had to fight thought they were fighting for. And why did they risk their lives? What did they think about the issues of the war? What motivated them? And then over the years, I've taken a lot of students and alumni of Princeton University, where I taught for many years, to the battlefields of the war. And on one occasion at Gettysburg, as we stood next to the Virginia Monument, looking across the open fields toward the Union lines on Cemetery Ridge, a couple of the students asked me, how could these men go forward against that wall of fire that they knew would be coming at them as they crossed those open fields? And I couldn't satisfactorily, or at least satisfactorily to me, answer that question at the time, even though I had been thinking about these issues. And then on another occasion, a man named Ed Barse, who was the chief historian of the War Department of the United States government, the Interior Department, Park Service, actually, who was famous for giving Civil War battlefield tours. And he told me about one experience he had had at Antietam when he was taking the chief of staff of the U.S. Army around to show him the battlefield of Antietam. And they came to Bloody Lane, and they saw the photographs of all the dead Confederate soldiers in Bloody Lane after the fighting that took place there. And Ed told him also about the Union troops that had attacked there and the casualties they suffered. And the chief of staff of the U.S. Army said, you couldn't get American soldiers today to make an attack like that. And I wondered when Ed told me that story, yes, I can understand why no one would want to go forward against that wall of fire. But why did Civil War soldiers do it? What motivated them to go against the wall of fire? So those two personal experiences in particular, one at Gettysburg and one at Antietam, motivated me to go into this question more seriously than I had in my previous reading, and to go to the sources themselves, the writings of these soldiers, not what they wrote in their old age when they were looking back at their experience in the Civil War and romanticizing it, the distortions of memories and so on, but what they wrote at the time. And those sources are incredibly rich, and I think also extraordinarily frank. They wrote mostly to family members. These letters were uncensored. They could say whatever they thought. They were very literate. These were the most literate armies in history up to that time. 95% of the Union soldiers could read and write, 85% of the Confederate soldiers. They wrote hundreds of letters, many of them, during the course of the Civil War, and many of them kept diaries. There was no prohibition on keeping diaries as there was in later wars. So you could get as close to what they really thought, what they really felt, by reading these letters, especially letters. Sometimes the diaries were frank, but they were not very detailed. But when they had to explain to their fathers, their brothers, their sisters, their wives, especially to wives, why they were doing this, because they were most of the Civil War soldiers, nearly 95% of them were volunteers. They were not draftees. They were not there because they were compelled to be there by the state or by the government, but by their own choice, their voluntary choice. So they felt it necessary to explain frankly what they thought. What were they fighting for? What did they think this war was about? Why were they willing to risk their lives? And so I decided to go into that question in great detail. And so I wound up reading the letters or diaries of about 1,000 of these soldiers, pretty much balanced on both sides, Union and Confederate. And I tried to get roughly proportionate sample of their letters and diaries from all the different states and regions of both the North and the South. And I think I came pretty close. I mean, there are clearly going to be rationalizing in their letters sometimes, trying to make themselves appear to be more committed and less afraid than they really were. But I think that looking at these letters and to some extent the diaries, I got closer to what they really thought than in any other way that would be possible. And then I sat down to put together my findings and write this book.
Well, you summarized that end part pretty quickly there, but there's a lot of logistics, I'm sure, that were involved in getting a hold of all those letters and reading through them. And you're dealing with, you know, handwriting and all the likes. And so, may I ask you, how long did it take you to do all the research to write this book?
Well, I started the research in the late 80s, 1987, 1988. I was teaching during these years, but I did have sabbatical leave during the course of the research. And it took me about 7 or 8 years going around to different historical societies, research libraries, and so on. So it was a slog, as it were, but it was something that I really enjoyed because, as you said earlier, I got to know these people, to understand them as human beings, as I was able to achieve a degree of empathy and understanding. And in fact, I think I got to know some of these people, in many cases, as many as maybe 200 letters in the course of their service in the Army. I think I got to know them better than I knew any real people in my contemporary life, because they sometimes put their heart and soul in these letters, especially married men who are also, in many cases, most cases, fathers. They had to explain to these very intimate people who were part of their lives and were afraid that their lives might come to an end. They had to explain to them, especially to wives, why they were doing this. And so many of these letters were quite heartfelt and, of course, self-justifying, but also with a degree of empathy with the people to whom they were writing, and trying to make them understand and sympathize with them.
Wow. Jim, speaking of wives, so this project that you were involved in must have really taken a lot of your heart and soul. What about your wife while you were writing this book and researching it? What was her role in that?
Well, she was my research assistant. She traveled around with me to these libraries, most of them, and became as much a participant in the whole project as I was myself. It really made things much easier for me, or if not easier, I was able to do more than I would have been able to do if I was on my own. And she understood what I was trying to do in this project, and became very sympathetic with it. And she could have written the book herself, I think, if I hadn't done so. And she was able to provide me with some insights, especially from the women's point of view, because some of the letters that I encountered were letters from wives to husbands, which they had to answer in explaining what they were trying to do. So the insights that she was able to provide were important to this project.
Oh, well, the work is magnificent, and I'd like to maybe address some of the the stories that were told through these letters about why these soldiers fought and what their challenges were. I'd like to also talk about the fact that while you're reading these letters, there were different things involved as far as the perspective of the soldiers themselves. First of all, some were Confederate, some were Union, some were officers, some were just rank and file. And then there were the time frames between the beginning of the war and the end of the war and how the war was going. So all those things are in the mix as you're reading these, you're hearing from these voices of these people. I'd like to start with like the early days of the war, like the 1861, and what some of the big motivators were initially before really the battles started? What were the initial motivators?
I think it was what the French call rage militaire, military rage. In the case of Northern soldiers, the firing on Fort Sumter, the firing on the flag, caused them to react in the same way that I think Americans did to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. They rushed to the enlistment offices, joined up. It was a kind of outburst of patriotism and anger, rage, if you will, rage militaire. In the case of Southern volunteers, it was a response to the notion that they were their society, their country, their land was going to be invaded. They were going to have to defend their homes and hearths from what they now considered to be an alien enemy. So the initial motivation was an outburst of anger and patriotism. Uh, that's my family's dog. I don't know what he's barking about. Somebody's probably at the door. He's expressing his rage militaire.
So what about as far as the people marching off, the men marching off to war? Was it something like it happened within communities where I think what I understood is many communities sort of together, people who knew each other, lived next to each other, family members sort of joined up together in mass in the beginning?
Yeah, the mobilization on both sides, the Union and Confederacy, was mobilization from the bottom up. People in various towns and communities around the entire United States and what had then recently become the Confederate States would call for a mass meeting in the local hall of one kind or another. And community leaders would get up and make patriotic speeches and call for men to enlist. And they did. And then they would offer, let's say, a company from Paddock Junction to the state governor. And the state governor would put all of these volunteer groups together and form regiments and offer them to either the United States or the Confederate States government. So it was a mobilization of mass enthusiasm from the bottom up. And then the two War Departments, as they were called then, and Navy departments too, but primarily the War Departments. The very largest percentage, of course, went into the armies rather than the navies. Would take over and would provide the kind of bureaucratic and professional organization to turn these volunteers into soldiers and then into armies.
And what about the officers? How were the officers selected?
According to the militia tradition, which was the basis of this initial mass organization, the company officers, lieutenants and captains, were actually elected by the men themselves. And then usually the the state governor would appoint the field officers, the colonel, lieutenant colonel, and major. So it was both a bottom up mobilization, but also a bottom up organization. As time went on, incompetent officers were weeded out. Either they would be discharged or they would resign themselves because they knew that they were not being able to do the job. And the whole process became more professional, top down, from all the way from the president down to army commanders and colonels at the state level. But at the beginning, it was a voluntary process in every respect.
Was there a sense of, I mean, they call it today FOMO, fear of missing out. Was there a sense in the community that if you didn't go, that you were missing out on this, being this involved in this patriotic fervor or something like that?
Yes, there certainly was, and it worked in two ways. One was the idea that you were missing out on this great adventure, but the other was that you would be shamed if you didn't. You would somehow betray your friends, your community. You would be dishonored if you didn't, if you stayed home in this national emergency. So it worked in two ways, both a kind of a positive way, I guess. This is what I want to do. I'm gung ho about this. But also, if I don't do this, I'll never be able to hold my head up again.
That was a big motivator. But let's think about it now. This is early. There hadn't been a major confrontation yet. It's probably a lot easier to say, "Hey, yeah, I better go because I don't want to look bad." But then Bull Run happens, and if I may be wrong, you correct me if I am. But didn't people initially think this is going to be a quick thing, and there were only like 3 month enlistments, and weren't there people who actually went to the battlefield at first Bull Run to think they were looking at a show or something like that?
Yes, at first people did not have a realistic vision of what this war was going to be like. And on both sides, civilians who stayed home and men who enlisted and joined the armies thought maybe one big battle and it'll be over. And we will have won. I mean, both sides were confident. Bull Run was a disillusioning experience for the North because they lost the battle, but it functioned in a way of it increased the determination. Okay, we lost. The other side won the first quarter, but we're going to, come back and we're going to win the game. So it increased their determination, and it also convinced them that they needed to have a more realistic and professional attitude toward what they needed to do. In the case of the South, the victory there convinced some, not all, but convinced some that they had this war already won, and that the North would just give up and recognize the independence. But of course, that didn't happen because all it did was provoke the North to renewed and increased determination.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking now when I'm listening in your book about the letters from the men after they had encountered, what do they call it? The elephant, I think you mentioned it was called, and how their motivating factors started to shift in some ways, maybe from patriotism to also their comrades and the men that they were fighting with and their company. Could you talk a bit about that?
Well, yes, and let me do it by explaining the three stages that I used to focus the process that took place here. And I call that initial motivation, sustaining motivation, and combat motivation. I've already talked about initial motivation, this outburst of patriotism and rage militaire. They fired on the flag, or they're going to invade. We need to defend our homes and firesides. Sustaining motivation, that's the most important thing. I mean, it's one thing for tens of thousands of men to volunteer and to be gung ho, but after the first battle or after the first combat that they get into, what keeps them going? Because remember now, these are volunteers. Conscription hasn't happened yet in either North or South. That came later, and never was a major factor in sustaining motivation. But what keeps you going after you've actually seen the elephant, after you've encountered combat? Well, I before I started this project, I read quite a bit about the psychology of combat and the psychology of soldiers. Most of it growing out of research that was done on American soldiers and to some degree on British soldiers and German soldiers in World War II. Studies by psychologists, by sociologists about why men fought in World War II. And the dominant theme in that literature was the concept of what they called, in their sociological language, primary group cohesion. That is, the soldier becomes a member of his company. It's a band of brothers. It's a form of love among males, one for all and all for one. That the major motivating factor for soldiers in World War II, according to this literature, was not basically fighting for democracy or fighting for racial superiority in the case of the Germans, or fighting to defend your homeland in the case of the British, for example. But it was this male bonding, this primary group cohesion. You fought for your friends, and they fought for you. Well, I found that to be true to a considerable degree for Civil War soldiers, too. There's no question about that. That's what made it possible for them to face the bullets, because they couldn't let their buddies down. If their company, if their mess, if their regiment was going forward, they had to go with them, because this is they would be shamed and dishonored if they did not. But there's an intervening motivation. I call that combat motivation. But there's an intervening stage which I called sustaining motivation. What kept him in the Army for 3 years or for 4 years in some cases? Well, the World War II literature said that it wasn't really so much this idea that we were fighting for democracy, or we were fighting to defend our homeland, or we were fighting for some notion of liberty and freedom and constitutional law or international order, as in the case of World War II. It was this band of brothers. But I found in the Civil War, there really was an ideological dimension to what I called sustaining motivation. These men understood the parameters of their society. They were fighting basically for the survival of, in the case of the Confederacy, obviously, survival of their nation. If they lost the war, there would be no Confederacy, which of course is what in the end happened. But and it's easier to understand in the case of the Confederacy. They were fighting to defend a social order based on slavery. They were fighting to defend what they called self-government, just as their grandfathers had done in 1776 when they seceded from the British Empire. They seceded from what they called a Yankee Empire in 1861 to form their own new society based, of course, on slavery. And they wrote about this. They talked about it. That's what kept them in the Army. That's what kept them going. In the case of the North, it's not so easy to understand because they were not defending their homeland so much. But I came to see from reading their letters and diaries that they felt sincerely and deeply that if they lost this war, the United States would cease to exist. It would become a fatal precedent by which any time in the future that an aggrieved part of the country felt that it was being persecuted or it lost the national election, as the Southern states did in 1860, they would just pick up and leave the government, that the United States would no longer exist. That this vision of the founding fathers of a new society, a city on the hill, if you will, would cease to exist. That was formed a really deeply rooted conviction on the part of Northern soldiers that kept that army together through a series of demoralizing defeats in the basically in the second year of the war. So I became convinced, and it became one of the dominant themes in the book, that both sides were really fighting for a vision of what society and their society and government ought to be, and that if they lost the war, that vision would cease to exist. Just as, of course, the Confederacy did cease to exist when they lost the war. So my argument is that unlike soldiers in World War II, if that literature was correct, they really did they knew what they were fighting for, and they were deeply convinced that it was worth fighting for.
In the book, you talked about, well, you had said before that literacy was higher than it had been prior to the Civil War, that there were newspapers being read, people were staying current with what was going on, that there were actually conversations going on around the campfire, because what I know about the Civil War, it was you were either engaged in a horrible bloodbath of battle, or you were dealing with agonizing boredom in camp, but they would have conversations with each other. And what I also noticed was that there were differences in the ideologies with the Union soldiers, in that some really couldn't give a rap about slavery, whether it was slavery or not. That was all more about the preservation of the Union, you know. And then there were others who were very passionately abolitionist in their thoughts, and then there were those who changed their thoughts.
Well, one of the themes in the book also is that this war for the Union became eventually in their minds, as it did in the minds of the leaders in the North, a war for freedom and the abolition of slavery, because they saw slavery as the basis for disunion. And if you were going to fight a war to defeat disunion and the breakup of the United States, you had to strike against the institution that was the basis of disunion, and that was slavery. So a lot of the Northern soldiers who, as you said, couldn't give a fig about the abolition in 1861 had changed their minds by 1863 or 1864, and actually saw themselves as an army of liberation. Not everybody, not all the soldiers, but certainly a substantial majority of them by the last year or so of the war believed that. That's why nearly 80% of the Northern soldiers who had the right to vote in absentee vote in 1864 for President Lincoln's reelection on a platform of bringing slavery to an end in order to bring this war to an end, victorious end, voted for Lincoln. And what they were also voting for was the end of slavery as an outcome of this war. So the great change was that, and that change took place primarily in the North. In the case of the Southern soldiers, they were fighting for the preservation of slavery as part of the larger society for which they were fighting, which was a slave society. So they never really changed their minds about that. In the end, of course, slavery was crumbling. And in the last desperate gesture, the Confederate government even took substantial steps toward bringing slavery to an end in order to recruit former slaves to fight for the Confederacy. Well, of course, that never happened. But they were beginning to move in that direction when Appomattox brought the war to an end.
Yeah. I was thinking that I would imagine the vast majority of Confederate soldiers did not hold slaves, because they were laborers, farmers, whatever, blacksmiths or what have you. Would it be more the officers would be more likely to hold slaves?
Vast majority needs to be dissected. It's quite true that a very large majority of the Confederate soldiers were not slaveholders. But remember that the average age of a soldier in the Civil War was in the low 20s. Many of these Confederate soldiers who did not personally own slaves at the age of 21 or 22, let's say, or 23, or even 18 or 19, were nevertheless members of slaveholding families. So Joe Gladhar who has written about this. He's done a book on the Confederate Army where he's looked at all the census material. Nearly 40% of the Confederate soldiers belonged to slaveholding households. That is, they did not personally own slaves, but they were sons of slaveholders, or they lived in a household that owned slaves, and they had that kind of a stake in the survival of a slave society. Then, in addition, a lot of small farmers who didn't belong to a slaveholding family, nevertheless, saw slavery as the basis of their own privileged white status in a slave society. They may not have had an direct economic stake in slavery, but they had a cultural and social stake in white supremacy, which was based on slavery. So they had as strong a commitment in many cases, in most cases, I think, to slavery as the basis of white supremacy as the large slaveholder did to slavery as the basis of his prosperity. I think the typical Southern soldier was fighting for the preservation of a slave society, even if he did not personally belong to a slaveholding household.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. I haven't heard it back like that. I didn't think of it that way, that they were part of a household, even though they specifically didn't own a slave. Now, as the war progressed and it started getting uglier, of course, the vast majority of the Civil War battlefields are in the South. And what about the as far as the Confederates, as far as home and hearth versus the Yankees they were away from home. They were away from home, but it wasn't their families directly that were being threatened. How did that affect the Confederate soldier, rank and file?
Well, I think it would be a fair generalization to say that the typical Confederate soldier had a more desperate, to use that word advisedly, a more desperate determination to defend his country, his society, and he thought of it as his country, than the typical Northern soldier, because they were defending their home and hearth from an invading enemy. And that makes it all the remarkable to me that the Northern soldier was able to sustain, Northern soldiers in general were able to sustain their commitment because they were not basically fighting for the defense of their families and their home and hearth and their land. They were fighting more for an idea. But it's interesting for the people of the Civil War generation, and this applies to both sides. They look back upon their revolutionary grandparents as the greatest generation. We talk about it, we look back on the World War II generation as the greatest generation. They look back on the revolutionary generation as the greatest generation. And they felt that they were fighting to sustain the honor, the vision, the achievements of that generation. But the great irony of the Civil War is that both sides felt they were fighting to sustain that heritage, that legacy, but they interpreted the heritage and the legacy in opposite ways. And that's in some ways not only the irony, but the tragedy of the Civil War, is that both sides were fighting for the same vision of sustaining the legacy that great generation had left for them, but they were fighting against each other. In a way, that's why I'm a Civil War historian. Understanding that is a step toward understanding the nature of the society that we, in our generation now in the 21st century, have inherited from previous generations, including the Civil War generation. We look back on the Civil War. If a person comes from South Carolina, if a white person comes from South Carolina or Mississippi, they look back on the Civil War differently from somebody who comes from Massachusetts or Ohio. Yet all of them would say that they look back on the Civil War generation as a heroic generation that was fighting for causes that they believed in. And to understand the relationship between generations and the way in which those generations look back on a previous generation and are committed to sustaining that heritage is a way of understanding the complexity, the ironies, I guess, and also the in some ways the greatness of our history, but also the tragedies of our history.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as far as if we could explore the home and hearth piece a little more. So down in the South, where most of the fighting, or almost all the fighting, is taking place, you've got people, they're defending their homes, but was it true then that there were more desertions in the Confederate, or what do you call them, stragglers, or what's the term?
Well, we need to make a distinction between stragglers and desertions.
Okay.
Although to some degree they're connected and maybe one flows into the other. A deserter is somebody who leaves the army and doesn't intend to come back. A straggler is somebody who on the march or in battle holds back and sort of tries to stay out of the battle or stay away from the combat, but then maybe shamefacedly returns to the army. He doesn't try to go home. Both sides suffered from straggling because when push comes to shove, even though you believe in what you're fighting for, when the bullets start flying, maybe you're not going to feel that sense of solidarity with your buddies. You're going to say, maybe I don't feel so well. I can't go forward. That's the straggling. That's what the Civil War armies would call skulking. Coffee boiling, you go off in the woods and boil coffee rather than go forward with your buddies. And I personally think there was a relationship between the volunteer soldier who did go forward with his buddies, not only because he couldn't bear to leave his buddies behind or to skulk away from his buddies, but also because he believed in what he was fighting for. There's, in other words, a relationship between the sustaining motivation, which is an ideological conviction that keeps you in the army, and your willingness, your combat motivation, your willingness to face the bullets.
Yeah.
In other words, it's not just this primary cohesion, it's also a deep-rooted belief in what you're fighting for.
Yeah, and
that
also,
enables you to face the music, the bullets.
also, I'm thinking about those soldiers. I remember the movie Last of the Mohicans, one of my favorite movies. And I think in that movie the colonial militia was there, and I think there was a fear that the enemy was going to be attacking their homes and everything like that. So they were being wanting to go home and defend their actual homes and not stick with the army. And I think the thing is that I think about the Confederates, where there's a thought of a Yankee invader, that they're coming in and who knows what they're doing. They're coming into the towns and villages of their families, and they're nowhere near because they're off on another battlefield. Where there are those who left to try to go back and defend their home instead of just trying to escape bullets, or maybe they're trying to do both.
Well, that is true of Confederate soldiers, especially in the last year or so of the war. Especially a Confederate soldier, let's say from Georgia, fighting in the Army of Northern Virginia, and a lot of them were, and they read about Sherman in Georgia. In other words, there did become a pretty serious tension in the Confederate Army between defending their homes and their families from the enemy who was there in Georgia or in Mississippi while they were in Virginia, let's say, and going home. And it did cause desertion in the last year of the war. The Confederate part of the story of Confederate defeat is the gradual collapse through desertions of the Confederate Army in the last year or so of the war. Yes, that's quite true. And the Northern soldier never had to face that decision. He did have to face a somewhat similar decision if he was a father and if he was married. Some of them would get letters from their wives saying, what'll happen to us if you get killed? It's not what's going to happen to us if the enemy comes and burns our house down. What'll happen to us if you get killed 1,000 miles away in Georgia and I'm up here in Michigan with 3 children to take care of? So the Northern soldier did have to face a version of that, but it's not defending so much the home from the enemy as it's defending your family from your own death.
Yeah, that resonated a lot with me because I was trying to put myself in that position when I was, younger, and I had young children. I'm off fighting a war, or maybe, my wife would be upset with me for volunteering, for not finding a way to get home or whatever, because my first loyalty should be to my wife and my children, which is it's just something that is it's a natural thing that you're there to defend your family first. But there was a real from those letters, the excerpts that you were, presenting in your book, it was this real sort of tension between this is my country, these are my comrades. I've been through hell with these people back, hell and back. But my wife is, there's problems at home. I imagine economically it was very difficult to have a pair of hands gone. And, if it's a farm, it requires a lot of upkeep. What are they doing? Are they suffering too? A lot of tension, but you hear different thoughts. There was some of the letters, the men were getting sort of annoyed with their wives for giving them trouble over this. Like, "Hey, just don't bother me with that stuff."
You've summarized it very well. I mean, this was true in soldiers on both sides. They did have to face this kind of divided loyalty. They rationalized it, and this was true among Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers. They rationalized this by saying, yes, my family is important to me and it's my primary responsibility, but also my country is important. And what kind of family, what would be the future of our family if we no longer have a country? And they would also respond with what we might call a version of male honor. I will be dishonored if I don't fight for my country. And my family will be dishonored if I desert and come home, or if I don't enlist in the first place. We talked about that earlier. I don't want my children. When my children grow up and somebody says to them, "What did your father do in the war?" I don't want them to have to say, "Oh, he wasn't in the war," or he came home, or he deserted. So there's that concept of male honor that was at war with family responsibility, if we can call it that. And that tension existed throughout the war, no question about that. And soldiers did have to balance those competing responsibilities, those competing loyalties. And it presented real difficulties to a lot of them. But the way they responded was, as I said, I have to fulfill both responsibilities, my responsibility to the family and to the country, and I am fighting for the preservation of this society in which my family is rooted. My family is a part of that society, and if the society is destroyed, my family will suffer. That's the way they rationalized it, and that may have been a rationalization rather than substantively true, but that was the way they tried to deal with it. What was a real tension, no question about that. But on both sides, it was a little higher for the Confederacy than for the Union. Something like maybe 30% of the soldiers were married, and maybe 25% of them had children. So the majority of soldiers on both sides were single, and they didn't have to face this. They sometimes would have to deal with their mother who said, "Oh, I'm afraid you'll be killed." And that's a different kind of tension that they faced, but it's not as serious as the tension of the family man, the father.
Absolutely. Another thing I noticed were the ideological differences that they had with people from home. Some of the letters were very passionate, particularly in the Union Army, where some family member, I don't know if it was a brother or a father, whether they were a copperhead or
Yeah,
they just were not, they didn't agree with the Union's strategy or what they were trying to do, and that whether it was worth it or not. And then you had the very patriotic soldiers basically almost threatening to come home and shoot the person. They were
well,
that passionate.
look at it this way. In 1860, in the election of 1860, probably 45% of the northern voters, northern free state voters, did not vote for Lincoln. They voted for either the Democratic candidate, Stephen Douglas or John Breckinridge, or the constitutional candidate, John Bell. They did not vote for this anti-slavery, anti-pro-black, these black Republicans.
Mhm.
By 1864, in other words, only maybe 55% of free state voters voted for Lincoln. Of course, that enabled him to carry nearly all the northern states and that gave him the electoral votes necessary to win the election. But in 1864, nearly 80% of the soldier vote voted for Lincoln. It's re-election. So the Republican vote, which equated to an anti-slavery vote by 1864, went from 55% to nearly 80%. In other words, the soldiers, many of them, became radicalized, interpreting the Republican Party on the issue of race and slavery as the more liberal or radical party by their experience in the war, whereas the stay-at-homes, their fathers, their older brothers, or people who didn't join the army, did not become radicalized. And that made the soldiers look upon the stay-at-homes as somebody who didn't really know what was going on and what was important. And they weren't, in other words, they weren't being supported on the home front, and they became very angry about that. And especially if they were pro-Copperhead Democrats, they were looked upon as potential traitors. You're not supporting us in the army. You're not supporting the cause. And I have more respect for a Confederate soldier who's fighting for a cause, even though it's a bad cause, than I do for the Copperhead at home, who sympathizes with the enemy cause. So you're right, quite right. The soldiers would write home and say, "I'd rather come home and clean out the Copperheads than or when I get out of the army, I'm going to take care of those guys." They didn't, there was real anger there sometimes.
Yeah, I noticed in one of the letters, it was somebody was saying that they were, or I don't know, it was a letter, or you were summarizing from it that there was a more of a camaraderie sometimes with the enemy who was out there giving it their all than the quote cowards at home, unquote,
Exactly.
cowards on the battlefield even. But let me ask you this: what role did absolute hatred for the enemy play, particularly towards the end of the war, particularly in the South, I guess, right?
It was a pretty serious, especially for Confederate soldiers. These enemies are coming down and destroying our society, burning our crops, burning our houses. So there was real hatred, and I think that was a stronger motivation for Confederate soldiers than for Union soldiers. It wasn't absent among Union soldiers because, their buddies had been killed too. But there was also a tension between that hatred for the enemy and what you mentioned a moment ago, greater respect for the enemy than for the cowards back home. Because the enemy, even though you hate what he stands for, you respect his commitment to defend what he stands for. So there are all these cross-cutting tensions that make the study of this so fascinating for somebody like me who's looking back and trying to understand what made these people tick.
Yeah, I think about Andersonville prison, and I think about the way that those prisoners were treated. Really, and I know the opposite was true for camps for Confederates, but Andersonville always stands out as the big story. But there has to be some degree of hatred for your enemy there to perpetrate that sort of stuff, as they were helpless. They were prisoners. They weren't on the battlefield anymore. It seems to me that you've got sort of a melting pot of all these different viewpoints from all these letters, all being in a place where you're a prison guard or you're a prisoner, and all those different ideologies and passions and hatreds and respect and all that is sort of into one ball. But what a tragedy that was.
Yeah. Well, there's no question but that prisoners on both sides hated the prison administrators and the prison guards. So on the one hand, they could at least respect the enemy soldiers who faced them in open combat, but the prisoner who persecuted them when they were helpless in prison was something else. And talk about hatred, that's where it really came down. You do find that happening. And that became a source of bitterness that lasted for a generation or more after the war, too. Prisoner memoirs would keep alive this feeling of hatred for if not for the enemy soldier, but for the enemies who administered these prisons and persecuted the prisoners.
Well, this has just been such an eye-opening experience listening to your audiobook twice. I recommend it to anybody who really wants to do a deep dive into what was going on with the individual soldiers who were fighting that awful war. It was such a brutal experience for the soldier out on the field, but there were also all these tensions that you draw a picture of, the tensions between the people at home, different ideologies within the companies of soldiers, perhaps, the passion to be there for each other, to see it through, to not miss out. I mean, I think there was a letter where somebody was deathly ill. They were so sick. They really did deserve not to go into battle, and yet they did it anyway. That's how
They
strong
didn't,
it was.
they didn't want to be understood as playing off. Even so, sick men who were afraid that their buddies would think that they were trying to get out of battle by playing sick,
Mhm.
even though they really were sick. They would sometimes go ahead with their buddies because otherwise they would suffer dishonor. I mean, the phrase "death before dishonor" sounds like some sort of braggadocio to us, but it was really serious for some of these people. The worst thing that could happen to them was dishonor. I
Yeah.
think they had both sides. I think they had a higher concept of the meaning of honor and how that was central to their self-respect, if you will, than maybe we do today.
Yeah, and I think one last tension that was there for those soldiers was the desire and the need to have honor and respect and to show courage and to be there for your fellow soldiers. But many of those soldiers also carried into the army their faith, their Christian faith. And there was a tension between their faith of thou shalt not kill, being there for your buddies, honor your country, fighting for the right thing. Can you just spend a minute maybe to talk about that tension?
Well, quite a few of the soldiers would try to deal with that because they did come out of a very Christian background. How could you be a Christian and kill your fellow man? Because Christianity teaches you to turn the other cheek, to love your enemy. Christ's teaching was that opposed to war and opposed to violence. This was a real problem. I think at the most basic level, a kind of visceral level, when you really faced the enemy who's trying to kill you, you rationalized it with some version of the phrase kill or be killed. Or if you were more intellectual and you had read some of the medieval philosophers, Christian philosophers, you would say this is a just war. We are fighting a defensive war. The other side is the aggressor, and therefore we will be forgiven the sin of killing. They had a hard time rationalizing this, but most of them managed to get around it one way or another in the end. There were conscientious objectors, Quakers, Mennonites, Amish, other sects who did not go into the army, refused. They actually made provision for these people to get out of the draft when they finally did impose a draft. But they were relatively few. Most people on both sides, even though they did come out of a fairly religious background, this generation was a product of the Second Great Awakening in the history of American Christianity, in the from the 1820s to the 1850s. But so they did have to face this issue of reconciling "thou shalt not kill" with killing. But most of them managed to do it, maybe with the most twisted logic, but they'd still manage to do it.
A lot of tensions going on there. All the soldiers who fought in that terrible war. One last question for you, Jim. As a historian, as a professor, as a human being, how did researching and writing this book with your wife, how did the whole experience impact you?
Let me put it this way. As I think I mentioned earlier, I got to know a lot of these people through their letters and diaries better than I knew many of my own friends or colleagues at Princeton University, for example, because I'm reading their letters to family members or to wives or to close friends, where they're bearing their heart and their convictions. And when I discovered, as I did discover many, many times, that the person I'd been reading letters of got killed in the next, in a battle, or died maybe of disease, contracted typhoid fever or something in the army, I felt very sad. I felt like a friend, a close friend, had died. So I got to understand the human dimension of this great but also terrible human experience of the war on a level that I wouldn't have understood it if I hadn't been reading all of these letters. It made me a better historian, I think. It gave me empathy with people who lived in the past, particularly these people that I'd gotten to know so well.
Jim, you're a masterful researcher and storyteller because you had to weave it all into a story. All those individual letters, you and your wife both did a fantastic job. It must have required a lot of patience and a lot of emotion involved. And I noticed with a lot of the letters, you'd hear this person's voice and this passion, and they might have been 19 or whatever, and then it ended with, and 2 weeks later, they were killed at Five Forks or something like that. As a reader, you're like, oh.
That feeling, I went through that feeling more than once, that's for sure. Yep.
Jim, this has been a great experience. Again, speaking to you for a second time. I hope we can, you wrote out so many other books. Maybe we could set up another time to speak about one of your other works, because you really do such great work. And I love speaking with you, and I hope that we can catch up again soon and do another project together.
Well, I enjoy talking to you, and as I said to your wife, I always enjoy talking history, and it's great to talk history with you.
Well, thank you again, James McPherson, for Cause and Comrades, Why Men Fought in the Civil War. Again, I hope you have a great day today, and thank you again.
Well, thank you.
All right, James. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your History, Your Story. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Facebook, X, and Instagram to stay connected. We'd love to hear from you, whether you have questions, comments, or a story to share. Until next time, be well and God bless.